Hey everybody, welcome back to Worst Church Ever, where Chris and I have the opportunity to be the worst every single week. We're delighted that you've come and joined us for an hour. It feels like an honor to be with Chris and an honor to be with you, so thanks for being here. Chris, I am so excited about today. We have some really good stuff coming up. I think we're going to talk about some exciting topics, including continuing a little bit about the Jacob story. But before we jump into the main content, we got invited to be on a podcast. It was my wife's podcast, but it was still pretty awesome that we got to be a part of the Phoenix Effect podcast. If you haven't checked out on Facebook, we've got a link there, and you can also just check it out on all of the different streaming platforms, including YouTube. It's a good interview between Chris and myself and some of the folks that podcast on that channel. Chris, that was really fun to do that. It was really great to learn more about you in the midst of that, because even though we talk all the time, sometimes my wife asks questions or Kristen asks questions that I don't think to ask you. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was really great.
And they're very good, and they're very good at asking questions that aren't obvious, but that are then so obvious. That's the perfect question, even though I wouldn't have thought to ask that question. You know? Yeah, really insightful. And
just a plug for it, most of the stories that they have on that particular podcast are not just interviews. They're really people that are engaging some really important stories. Not that we didn't have an important story to engage, but I would say some of the things that are there are profoundly moving. There's stories about people who have immigrated here and had to shift into what it means to be an American when you're not actually from America, and people that have dealt with poverty and people that have dealt with oppression and sexual identity and all sorts of different stories of people just trying to find a sense of belonging. Check out a few of the other episodes while you're out there. Incredibly good show. And I'm not just saying that because it's my wife that is one of the hosts. It really is truly good work that they're doing over there. Be sure to check that out.
Hello and welcome back to Worst Church Ever. I am Chris.
And I'm Nathan.
And we're two lifelong friends navigating the intersections of the secular and sacred in this space every Monday, and all the days between in the course of our daily lives as husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus, rejecting fundamentalism and exploring cycles of trauma and healing in the redemptive stories of Scripture and in the reflections of the sacred all around us.
So grab some baked goods and a cup of coffee, because it's time for a discussion at Worst Church Ever. Add your thoughts and comments online, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep the conversation going. Chris, how's your week going? What's on your mind?
Week has been going pretty well. I, this weekend, got to go see a touring Broadway production of Girl from the North Country in Philadelphia. So I was at the Forest Theater in Philadelphia, about a 98-year-old theater, right sort of in the heart of the city. And this is a musical based on the work of Bob Dylan. It's actually the second musical based on the work of Bob Dylan. It was really an interesting experience.
Yeah, I imagine. So Bob Dylan, I know that song because I've listened to that quite a bit. In fact, I'm looking at the Johnny Cash poster behind you, and I was listening to the Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan version of that all morning, which I thought was really good. But I have not seen the play at all. But you kind of alluded to the fact that it was pretty complex.
It was very complex, and there was a lot of, it was very heavy. And I think by the end of it, I think I got to a cathartic place, but it was a lot, and it's set in 1934 in Duluth, Minnesota. So the backdrop is the Depression. And basically, without giving things away, you have the setting is a boarding house, and it's a boarding house that's pretty run down, and the people who own the boarding house are a month away from getting foreclosed on. They're middle-aged. They have a grown son and a grown adopted daughter. She's black. They are white. She was abandoned in their boarding house as a baby. The matriarch is losing her mind throughout the course of the play. The patriarch is dealing with all the issues at the bank. He's also dealing with managing all the personalities in the boarding house, most of whom are delightful and friendly and care about one another, but they all have their own very severe issues happening. Some of them all economic, but then also there's a couple who has a grown son who has very obvious learning disabilities. And they've lost all their money in the Depression. There are other characters who have similar sorts of sad stories. I don't want to say sad stories to minimize it, but real stories that felt so real. I'm watching this and I'm thinking every new revelation of the tragedy in this ensemble's life, collective life, but individual lives, is so staggering. And I'm just thinking to myself as I'm sitting there, God, this, and then I say, wait a minute, this is fiction. But then I think, no, it's not really fiction. It's real. These things happen to people all the time, everywhere. And then mixing in Bob Dylan's music, and the playwright did not shy away from using quite a bit of material from Bob Dylan's evangelical Christian period. So you have a lot of spiritual dynamics built into this play, one of which is that somebody who I think is one of the villains of the play is a pastor who is also a traveling Bible salesman. So that's really interesting. And there's been some really interesting academic work done on the spiritual themes of the play in relation to the Irish tradition, because it's an Irish playwright, but also in relation to Bob Dylan's larger work and Bob Dylan's spiritual life. For all these reasons, it was really heavy. And my son went with me. He's 16 and he's a theater kid and he wants to do acting for his profession, for his livelihood. And when Act 1 ended, he was like, this is really good, and then Act 2 similarly. And he said, there was no resolution. And it's if there was, you have to look for it, and you have to, there's a lot of borderland, thin places kind of stuff, a lot of shadowlands, a lot of ambassador between this world and the next potentially, and all kinds of stuff like that. But he really enjoyed it. One of the things that I found disturbing about the audience was that there were people sitting to my left and behind me who weren't enjoying it at all. And enjoying isn't the right word because it is so heavy.
Right.
But the music and the talent of the orchestra, and the orchestra is just people playing folk instruments that would have been available to them in the 30s. A drum kit, an upright bass, an acoustic guitar, piano, harmonicas, things like that. Fiddle, maybe a mandolin. But the people sitting next to me, they were baby boomers. Like, you would think that the Bob Dylan aspect of this would be right in their wheelhouse. And when Act 1 was over, it had 15 Dylan songs from all throughout his career. And the wife says to the husband, the only one I recognized was Like a Rolling Stone. I was like, why are you here? Like, you don't have to be a Dylan snob to enjoy the show. But if you're coming because you want to just hear the hits, like, you're really missing the point. And quite a few of the hits were in there,
Right.
But not all of them. Like, there wasn't Mr. Tambourine Man, and there wasn't Blowing in the Wind, and there wasn't, Knock on Heaven's Door. But there was, To Make You Feel My Love was in there from the 90s, which is the first Dylan record I ever bought, was the 90s Time Out of Mind, a Grammy-winning record from him later in his career. So,
even the title track, the one that I was listening to, he recorded with Johnny Cash. I think he recorded that in the 80s with Johnny Cash.
Oh, really? Was it that late?
I think it was that recently. I don't know that the song was, I don't think that was the first iteration of the song necessarily.
Yeah.
But the recording I was listening to was from that era, which, by the way, I like Dylan later, after he met Tom Petty and George Harrison and started not being so like, he and Elvis Costello have this accent that's just,
where did it come from?
Do it. I can't do it. I'm like, why did you think that was a good idea? Then again, I like Billy Joe Armstrong's fake British thing that he does. It's clearly, he's not British. So like, maybe that's
so glad you said that. Oh, can I just rant on all that for a second?
Absolutely.
So Irish Elvis Costello, Declan McManus is his real name, and he's Irish. Bob Dylan is Midwestern, Minnesota born, and that, I don't know where that came from. But the one song where it really, I think for Dylan, his 60s stuff, that accent works in a couple songs specifically, one of which is Chimes of Freedom. Another one is God on Our Side. But the one I think where it works best is Positively 4th Street. Because he's, you know what a drag it is to know you. Like, it's so whiny and annoying, but it really works. I cannot stand Billy Joe Armstrong doing the accent. I don't know why. I think it's because I am tired of him. Dude, he's pushing 60, and I have to be at the gym hearing him sing, the American dream is killing me. And I get it, bro, but you've been doing the same thing for 40 years now almost.
And you're a multi-millionaire. You could just quit.
Yeah. The genius of Green Day is they keep reinventing their own wheel, but they sell it to a new generation every 10 years.
Yeah.
And those kids have no idea. So I remember when I was leading a youth group in my 20s and all the kids were 14, 15, American Idiot came out, and they're like, "Have you ever heard of Green Day?" I'm like, "Have you ever heard of Dookie?"
You're like, the Green Day that we know was a little bit more teenage angsty, a little bit more, probably male.
Yeah, not quite as woke, I guess, right?
Yeah, not
and don't
quite
get me wrong, they do have some really good songs, obviously, and there are songs of theirs that I love from the 90s on, and I'm not trying to disparage any of their political stuff. I love when they got together with U2 and did The Saints Are Coming. That's really good. But just to follow up on this accent thing, and then you have our buddy Tom DeLonge, and
right, he's like the next generation of that.
Most of the time, I hate what he does with his voice, but there are a few songs where I love it, and one of them is All the Small Things, because that song's hilarious. Another one is, he doesn't sing a lot on What's My Age Again. I think that's mostly the other guy.
Yeah, the other guy.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. But
Mark Hoppus.
Yeah, Mark Hoppus. Yeah, and then on
Is
Miss
that right?
You,
Did I get it right?
Yeah, Mark, you're right. Yep. But on Miss You, I love that the interplay between them, where Mark Hoppus is "Hello there," and then what's his face is like extra whiny and extra sounds like an infant almost. But I think it works.
That's the thing. I think the interplay between the two voices, where Mark's got the traditional baritone, and then Tom's got the whiny thing going on, works really well. But when you have Billy Joel by himself, and there's nothing to play against, he's not as whiny. He's just more like that fake Brit accent.
Yeah, which is so funny because it's like a punk affectation.
Yeah,
and people always forget that punk music is the closest you can get to pure pop music in its structure. You know, it's straightforward, 3 chords, a steady rhythm. There's nothing revolutionary about punk music apart from saying, "Let's."
That was me dropping something.
It sounded like a drum roll. So
it was a mic drop.
Yeah,
it was a coin drop, really.
But you know what? That Phil Spector Wallace sound, let's not do that anymore. Brian Wilson, let's just go back to the garage. And that's just going back 20 years from when punk, whatever. Buddy Holly is the archetype for that.
There's probably more aligned with Bob Dylan and Green Day than there is with Green Day and, I don't know, Blink-182 in some ways.
Yeah, I can see that.
Maybe not Green Day as much. It's probably early punk rock is probably more aligned with Bob Dylan, where Green Day is like the next generation of it, where it's now become its pop incandescence, right? And so maybe there's a bigger connection between.
And people always talk about, in the same breath, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Clash. One of those bands is an excellent band, and that band is called the Clash. The Ramones are fine, and they do what they do really well.
Yeah.
And then the Sex Pistols, even you listen to Anarchy in the UK, okay? And it's hearing him snarl, "I am an anarchist, I am an antichrist," is that in itself was, I'm sure, so jarring. But the structure,
it's a pop song.
The Quarrymen, for crying out loud. You know what I mean? So it's just, but that's the beauty of it, right? Is that it's a DIY, anybody can do it. Pick up your instruments, play them poorly, and snarl, and you're making a political and social statement. And I think that's why it is what it is. And I think that's important. So I don't want to lose that in my bougie assessment of pop music. But I try to explain to my son that all music is pop music. I don't care what it is. And so when people say, "Why does the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have Mariah Carey?" Because all music is pop music. Not all music is bubblegum pop music, but all music is pop music, So
even those that try to be intentionally unpopular, like everyone from the 90s, except for Green Day. I read this really interesting article on Green Day and how they were in that scene, that punk scene, and they basically got kicked out. They've sold out.
Yeah.
And because they wanted to not have to live in the, dump.
Yeah. How dare they?
So, how dare they actually want to make money doing what they're doing?
And we've talked about this before, but I always go back to Nirvana too. Man Who Sold the World. Not Man Who Sold the World. That's a cover. But About a Girl is a Beatles song. Yeah. And even Heart Shaped Box is a brilliant pop song.
Oh, yeah.
Let alone, Smells Like Teen Spirit, More Than a Feeling. It's so good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all good stuff. By the way, for those that say that Kurt Cobain was a talentless hack, first of all, he wasn't, because the structure of the songs proves it. But secondly, I saw this really interesting video where apparently Eddie Van Halen had come backstage and was talking to Nirvana before a show, and he was all drunk, and This is all rumor, so I don't know if it's true, but it was this interview. And so he's in the crowd, and Kurt starts shredding on one of these solos, shredding. Because he knew, like, he was like, Van Halen was like, I want to come play with you guys. I want to come play with you guys. And they're like, you can't, no, you're going to like come up here and just take over. You can't do it. So he was like mocking him by shredding. But I mean, in the process of mocking him, he was sort of showing that he actually has chops. So his decision not to use his chops is in some way telling of what he was trying to accomplish. Not that he was necessarily the best, most talented guitar player of all time. I'm not trying to argue that. But he had more chops than we give him credit for. And certainly you don't just accidentally write 2, 3, really, if you include Bleach, and maybe even 4 if you include Incesticide. You don't write 4 bodies of work that have that many good songs on them if you're talentless hack, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then to go back to Dylan, to have not just 4 incredibly meaningful records, but how many Dylan records are there? Not all of them are incredibly meaningful, but you've got a number of them in the body of work that have substantial contributions to music. This guy, whether or not I like his accent on his 60s stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't matter.
It still has incredibly rich body of work. And in fact, the theme song for Parenthood, which is one of my favorite songs, Bob Dylan, and it's that "May God bless and keep you always." Yeah, that. Which was that in the musical?
It was a little bit. Yeah, a part of it was in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they managed to work that one in there, which is terrific. Like, he's just incredibly gifted songwriter and musician. And, you know, you probably wouldn't have made it without that weird accent. Everyone it was his shtick then.
Of course. And he was the first to do it. And, you know, he's coming up in the Greenwich Village folk scene. And, you know, and at that time, folk music is like the new Christy Minstrels and Peter Paul, and it's very polished. And Dylan's like, wait a minute, folk music should not be. And I think that's a big part of it, you know. Yeah. He was bringing that rawness back to it.
Yeah. I don't want to go too much back into, now that we've kind of gone off on a major tangent, but we've talked a lot about generational trauma here. We've talked a lot about motifs, recurring motifs. So it sounds like this play has a lot of recurring motifs in it, a lot of good stories there. Yeah. Earlier this week, we were talking a little bit about generational trauma coming out of World War II. This is pre-World War II, so this is still like that Dust Bowl Depression era. But it was interesting. My wife actually was talking to me earlier today about the Great Depression and mentioning both of her grandparents, and 2 of them had very difficult decisions that they had to make. Like, one was less of a decision, but her grandfather ended up running away from home, not because he necessarily had a bad childhood, but because he knew that it would be better off not to have another mouth to feed.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that was potentially happening. And then, speaking of mouths to feed, she was telling me that her grandmother would sometimes go a day and realize that this is the only meal she's getting, and maybe there's not going to be one tomorrow.
Yeah.
And there's still food insecurity in the United States, but not to the prevalence that it was certainly in the 30s.
Sure. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it was so widespread, and it cut across all of our fake boundaries and barriers. Of course, you know, it still persists. It's still a problem, but it's not at that scale. It's still a bigger problem than most people realize and think, but not like that. That's heavy. And so if you see this play, I'll tell you, be prepared to be triggered by a lot of different kinds of trauma involving children, involving poverty, involving mental health, a lot of stuff, involving race, incarceration, deaths, a lot of deaths. But you know, if I was moved by it, and you know, it was cathartic, and it was a good experience. You know, I can say that.
I think the best stories are ones that transcend the time period that they're cast in. So you see it's happening in the 30s, but you know that it's happening next door as well to some level.
Right. That's right. Yep.
What I think is interesting is, so this story takes place in the 30s. These folks, or the children of these folks, would be in World War II.
Mm-hmm. Some of them would have been, depending on. So the youngest people in this play, who were like 19 to 21, some of them would have been in the war, and then the people that were older than them would have not. But
would have stayed at home and done what they needed to do for the good of everyone. And they were already used to doing that because of this particular time period, which in some ways prepared them, in some ways didn't necessarily do any service for the boomers. This past week, Chris and I were talking about how post-World War II, you've got this just worldwide trauma that exists, both from post-traumatic stress disorder from a war, but also from the outworkings of incredible poverty. It wasn't just in the United States that poverty was a existing. This is a worldwide phenomenon. And I think a lot of the responses you see in the boomer generation are sort of just that reaction of parents that wanting to give as much as possible to this next generation because they never had anything, and also this generation that just didn't really understand what it was like. So it just
and I think we've talked about how the generation of men returning from the war returned to a different country and also had no resources to process any of their trauma, and a lot of them became alcoholics and abused their families, and so you see. Not that didn't always happen, but it feels so prevalent in that generation. Yeah. The generation of men who saved the world also are the generation of men who came home and had front row seats to this incredible social revolution that they felt like they had no part in, no place in, and so they act shitty.
Yeah.
Which is an understatement.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I actually saw a post today of one of those behaviors. So you may have seen this very iconic picture of a man in a Navy uniform and a woman in a nurse's uniform, and he's kissing her, and they're in the middle of, I think, New York City, and it came out later that was a non-consensual kiss. He was just caught up in the moment and decided he was going to kiss this woman. And a friend of mine, a friend is a loose term, acquaintance that I have on Facebook that posted this picture and said, "Happy Non-Consensual Acts Day," and with an air of sarcasm, and then went on to say that this particular picture, which had been an iconic photo of the end of the war, has since been treated with a little bit more scrutiny and was removed from this Veterans Association. And then there was this big uproar and they decided to bring it back. And I think this guy was celebrating the fact that we're going to have this non-consensual act back on the walls. And I think the rest of us are like, there's a reason that we took it down in the first place, because even though it's iconic, maybe to your point, maybe we shouldn't just prize the fact that you're going to go and kiss whoever you want without any sort of consent on the other side.
Yeah, I think it's okay to contextualize history, Yeah. And I understand that for decades and decades, that image we looked at that as a euphoric expression of the end of the worst thing that had ever happened to anybody. And no one knew that it was, whatever. And who knows? I don't know the whole story. Did she find it romantic? Maybe that doesn't matter. But yeah, that non-consensual taking for yourself, obviously we have to condemn that. We have somebody running for president who thinks it's his right to just grab whichever woman he wants by whatever part of her body he can reach. And of course, I'm not ignorant to the fact that the other guy running for president, there's a lot of footage of him being creepy with massaging shoulders and smelling hair. I'm not. But
I think it's fair to say that maybe this photo is an emblem of a time where we just didn't necessarily hold men to as high of a standard, or any standard of what was appropriate. As a single woman, you want to kiss her, go ahead. But now we've sort of crossed over to this place where it's not just a celebration where you're both caught up in a moment and, maybe you went a little too far. I mean, Mardi Gras happens every year too, and there's probably a lot of that stuff going on there. But, now you have a president or a president's-elect, not a president-elect,
a nominee.
Presumptive nominee at this point in time, and former president, who not only says that it doesn't really matter that it was a non-consensual act, it's actually my right, because I am in a place of power, that I can do that, and I can get away with it. And in fact, it's invited because of who I am. Right. And now you're seeing, but the lawsuits that are occurring are saying a different story, Mr. Trump.
That's right.
You thought that there was a power dynamic where it was welcome. It was not.
And it's not like Trump only had power when he became president 8 years ago. He's been powerful since he was born.
Yeah, he's come from power.
And unless you've been a victim, you have no real ability to process what it takes emotionally and spiritually and psychologically to come to terms with your victimization, with the assault, and with what you're going to do about it. Yeah. And we're learning that in brain science, and we're actually looking at eliminating statutes of limitations for sexual assault in different states and different jurisdictions for that very reason. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a recent article that came out actually on the 3rd of March in Rolling Stone about the amount of drugs needed to keep the Trump White House operating.
I saw the headline and I did not have the heart or the energy. Yeah.
So there's a need for taking speed to keep up with the demands of that job. And then there's a need for Xanax in order to get any reprieve once your shift or whatever your project is over, mixed with alcohol. And I think one of the comments in that article were like, you can't work for someone like that without needing Xanax and alcohol to recover?
I can only imagine that every administration has a similar problem, because I happen to know that two of the biggest demographic abusers of cocaine, for example, are airline pilots and cooks, chefs, people in kitchens. Okay. So if I need cocaine to get through a dinner rush, even at a mediocre, restaurant, I can only imagine what it's like to work for the president of the United States. I'm not making excuses, but it does seem like those high pressure situations are the people who find themselves, the ones telling themselves, okay, we need to get through this. I need something to push me through. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my job or whatever it is. And that's how the cycle starts. At least the caricature is, the 80s stockbrokers. But I know people who are fry cooks at the lowest level up to, high top chefs, and every kitchen is the same. Unfortunately, yeah. I'm not speaking from personal experience, but from knowing people and from having a spouse who is in the recovery treatment field. That's, I just know that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So again, I know we're not just trying to blast Trump, because the Kennedy administration had plenty of alcohol and drugs flowing through that too, right?
And John was probably at the top of that pyramid, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So again, this isn't throwing stones at Trump per se. It's just saying that
we can for other things, but yeah,
certainly.
It's not just the pressures of the job in Trump's case. It's also that environment was without a doubt the most chaotic White House ever to have existed. Maybe Ulysses S. Grant was like a close second, but I'm sure Trump's White House was completely chaotic. So take the regular pressures of the Obama White House or the Carter White House or whoever, add to it the guy doesn't know what he's doing at all from an institutional standpoint, also doesn't care, is completely careless and haphazard and scattershot in everything he does. It runs his administration that way. And then on top of that, you sign up because you think you're going to save America, and then a couple months into it, you realize, there's all this other shit happening that you're now a party to that you have to try to defend. And if you're not complete MAGA, you're going to have to treat your conscience with, self-medication, or you're going to have to quit.
I think you said it really well earlier that the loyalty only runs one way. And that's interesting. Nietzsche actually makes a really good remark that, and I don't think he was being prescriptive. I think he was being descriptive of the times, that this idea of the overman or the superman, or that Ubermensch, he calls it, is this person that's cast up into this role of being elevated above everyone else. And there's this sort of hyper loyalty to these people that seem to have just different rules that apply to them. And they don't have any regard for the people below them. They are in some ways this overlord, this overman, this god, so to speak. And Trump really has put himself in that position. I think that other presidents do as well. And it's just this different sense of loyalty. I think if you go into politics, or if you're a staffer in the White House, you would assume some kind of quid pro quo, like I'm doing all this work, but it means that I'm going to maybe have an opportunity to run for state senate, or maybe even become a senator one day, or a congressperson, or maybe I get an opportunity to go be a Supreme Court justice aide or something. There's this idea that there's some kind of quid pro quo. In this case, it's just basically, if you don't perform well, that not only is your career over, but you're going to get blasted by Trump on Twitter, and you're going to have potentially violence threatened against you because you weren't loyal to this. Talk about a high pressure situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm glad. I hope he wins, so the two of us can have our podcast targeted. That'll be great.
That will be fun.
Yeah, or loses. Either way, his thing's gonna be targeted.
It's not like he's going anywhere.
That's
right. Not, even if he loses, he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know which one's worse. Win or lose, I think we're gonna have a situation on our hands.
Oh, I think so too.
Yeah. Hey, so situations. Speaking of situations, maybe we should talk a little bit about Jacob before we lose time here.
Yeah.
Last time we left off, Jacob had this dream, which was, I think, only the second. Is that only the second dream in the Bible?
It might be.
Chronologically, it may not have been.
Yeah. I'd have to check, but it could.
Because Abraham has that covenant dream, and he has basically a recurring motif of a covenant dream with God.
Yep.
I don't know that there was any. I don't know that Isaac had any dreams. Isaac didn't really do much.
Poor Isaac.
Other than dig up his dad's wells and live in his mom's tent and get tricked and swindled by his wife.
This is why the Airborne Toxic event has a song called "Poor Isaac," and it's all about Isaac.
Yeah.
The guy wasn't allowed to even have dreams. Can you imagine?
Yeah. Can't even have dreams. That's good. He wasn't even allowed to have dreams. We're in 29, and I got 14 verses. I thought we'd maybe start with that. Jacob lifted up his feet and went on to the land of the Easterners, and he saw, and look, there was a well in the field, and look, there was 3 flocks of sheep that were lying beside it. For from that well they would water the flocks, and there was a stone that was big on the mouth of the well. And when the flocks were gathered there, they would roll the stone from the mouth of the well, and would water the sheep and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. And Jacob saw them and said, "My brothers, where are you from?" And they said, "We're from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, son of Nahor?" They said, "Oh, yeah, we know him." He said to them, "Is he well?" And they said, "He is well. And look, Rachel, his daughter, is coming along with the sheep." He said, "Look, the day's still long. It's not time to gather in the herd. Water the sheep, take them to graze." And they said, "We cannot until all the flocks have gathered and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well, and we water the sheep." He was still speaking with them when Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it happened when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother's household, that he stepped forward and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kin and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and she told her father what had happened. And when Laban heard the report that Jacob, his sister's son, was there, he ran towards him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into the house. And he recounted to Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, "Indeed, you are my bone and my flesh." And that's 1 through 14. Doesn't seem like there's a lot there, but I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, I think you're right.
What are you thinking as I read through that?
I'm thinking of some of the symbolic imagery, Nathan, that you had kind of brought up before we started, but now it's striking me as very obvious. And I'm also thinking of the fact that verse 14 in the NRSV continues for one more clause and stops in the middle of a sentence. So in the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, it says, verse 14 is, "Then Laban said to him, 'You are my own flesh and blood.'" And the next part is half of the next sentence, which is, "After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month." This imagery of Jacob opening the well is leading me to think of cycles of fertility.
Yes, your fertility imagery there, for sure. In fact, it's interesting. I was looking at Alter's translation notes. I think I sent over a note to you earlier.
Yeah, I responded with a Schitt's Creek gif, by the way.
This is something you just don't get if you only read the English versions. In Hebrew, and I don't speak Hebrew, so I'm taking it from Alter's translation. In Hebrew, there's 2 words, one for he watered, which is watering the sheep, and he kissed, being Rachel, and they're so close. It's like they're homophones. So they're so close. You're seeing this illusion that like he's watering the sheep, he's watering Rachel, right? And so it's this idea that there's this symmetry there. And he even said they use the same pun later in Song of Solomon. So, I mean, which is quite sensual. So it's very overt here that this well is not just a well, but it's also a symbol of fertility, that he's moving the stone away, which might be symbolic of what's to come. There's going to be a little bit of work needed to actually get what he wants, even though he just runs up and kisses this girl. Speaking of non-consensual acts.
Yeah. And we don't plan anything here. When that all comes together, we call that the Holy Spirit.
I don't know what kind of kiss it was. Maybe it was a very cousinly kiss. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
could be. Could you imagine somebody running up to you, sticking their tongue down your throat and saying, "Hey, cousin, we're kin. We sure are kin. We're kinfolk."
Kissing cousins, as they call them.
Yeah, that's the name of an Elvis movie, by the way. Kissing cousins. Yeah.
Now that we're saying this out loud, he did get sent to Laban to find a wife. So this isn't just a cousinly kiss.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Isaac was sent to, not Laban, because it was his sister. You know, his sister was Rebekah, but He was sent to Laban and Rebekah's parents. He wasn't sent. It was his surrogate that was sent. But this motif of being sent to the sibling's household to gather a wife is clearly there. A complete stranger kisses her, and then he starts crying, and then tells her that they're related.
It's an interesting pickup move, isn't it?
Seems very much like the Times Square pickup move when you come back from war.
Yeah.
You grab the first nurse that you see, you give her a big old victory kiss.
Yeah.
And then maybe invite her on a date later. I don't know.
That's right.
That one didn't work. I don't think that ended up in a long-term relationship. If I know the story.
That I happen
correctly.
to know. Yeah.
So I do think it's interesting. Like, I think that is a very obvious fertility angle, and very clearly that language would be there in the Hebrew. The other thing that's interesting is it may be symbolic. I think some of the commentators have looked at this and said that removing the stone from the well may not just be symbolic of Jacob's struggle to get himself a wife, but also foreshadows Rachel's struggles later with fertility in general. Mm-hmm. As we'll see later on, she has a very difficult time conceiving, which is another motif which comes up over and over again in these stories of this idea that you need to be fruitful and multiply, and yet it is just not possible for everyone.
And you know what? There are even translations throughout the scripture where a woman who is not able to conceive, or who is barren, or whatever the modern medical diagnoses would be, is said to have, her womb is closed, is the phrase that you see in the scriptures. And so this imagery of this stone closing this well, stone being a heavy burden, childlessness being a burden that could have been a death sentence for a woman in a lot of ways. If you don't produce an heir, you're not going to be taken care of.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I can only imagine, and I haven't really researched this, but I can only imagine the early church fathers in the Christian era looked back at this and said, there's a typology here for the resurrection of Christ as well. Moving back the stone and new life, whether it be a well, and we have images of Jesus as the living water, the woman at the well, new life in the progeny of Jacob and Rachel, new life in the resurrection of Christ as the first fruits. There again, that idea of fruitfulness, the first fruits of the resurrection. So we always have to be cognizant when we're looking at the Hebrew scriptures that the original audiences have no understanding of Christology. And as Christians who believe certain things about Jesus, it's okay for us to look back and observe that and talk about that, but we don't ever want to make the mistake of saying the original audiences would have, understood that.
Yeah.
Or that it's necessarily true, by the way. But I certainly see that as one way of preaching this text that I don't think is irresponsible as long as you contextualize everything for people,
Yeah, I think that the one advantage of looking at these stories with more of a literary lens, one of the advantages of that is we're able to see these motifs. So one motif that we're seeing is the struggle of fruitfulness, right? That part of that curse that was given earlier in Genesis is that there's going to be trouble with childbearing in general, and part of that is this barrenness that keeps on popping up and still keeps on popping up in our lives today. These are ongoing issues that families have to face. But then another one that we're looking at is the same motif of being sent to the same family over and over again. So Isaac is sent to this family, or at least Isaac's proxy is sent to this family. And now Jacob's sent to this family. And, what happens when Abraham's seed shows up? There's going to be a marriage proposal. That's just what happens. We even saw that with Esau. He went over to Ishmael, right? And I'm going to go get a wife for myself from one of the cousins. There's this idea that when these folks show up, this is kind of it's a betrothal ceremony that's happening right here.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably evidence, but it's a little different. So if we look at, I don't think, Chris, you didn't cover the proxy for Isaac in previous podcasts, did you?
I think I know that I talked about how when they came back, they, lived and consummated in Sarah's tent. So I don't remember if I really made a point of talking about the surrogate aspect of it, however. Yeah.
I don't really know that I have anything to say about that other than if I recall from that story, because I didn't really look back and look at it in depth, but it was definitely a betrothal ceremony where there was the same motif of the well, if I'm not mistaken, where the servant goes, and there's this same exact interaction with the sheep, and drawing water and all that sort of stuff. And he's praying, God guide me, and, whoever comes and draws water and all that sort of stuff. And then, oh, lo and behold, here comes Rebecca. She draws water, and they have this whole interaction and he's like, oh, good. This is pretty easy. This is kind of reversed, where now Jacob's not necessarily waiting around and saying, let the first person that comes here that draws water for me be the betrothed. But he's like, there's Rachel. Hey, you guys don't mind sticking around to do some watering here, because I'm going to push the stone up and take care of things, right?
Yes. And it makes me think that, the phrase quick, fast, and in a hurry is coming to my mind, because the difference between what happens with Isaac and Isaac's surrogate going to that well in the first story, and then the surrogate praying, as you said, and then finding Rebecca, is that Isaac was not fleeing anything. So Isaac is still working from a place of relative privilege. Jacob is sent, but he is also fleeing. He is, in a sense, a fugitive, at least from his brother. So whereas Isaac has time and resources to send the surrogate and put on the show, and the surrogate's going to pray and all of these things, here we see Jacob, who is always trying to do the shortcut as the trickster, right? Here he is, again, it's expedience. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying in his mind, Esau is hot on his heels. I'm not going to wait around for someone to come. I'm going to open this well myself. There she is. What I'm trying to get at is, even in the literary construct of these passages, there's a sense of urgency that the writer is imparting that matches Jacob's fleeing, that need not have been present for Isaac, because Isaac didn't have anybody hot in his heels, because his father Abraham made sure that Isaac would be the favorite, was the favorite, or at least in terms of the covenant, the blessing and all those things. So his rivalry with Ishmael is very different in a lot of ways than Jacob's is from Esau.
How does verse 2 read for you? Because I think I have probably a little different sense of urgency, and I actually like the way that Alter translated this. How does verse 2 read for you?
So verse 2 in the NRSV updated edition says, there he saw a well in the open country with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it, because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. Yeah,
and so I think I'm hearing Alter actually put that urgency into this, the way that he's actually translating it.
So it could be in the original Hebrew that the urgency is there, but not in many of our English translations, because Alter's always trying to sort of match literarily the Hebrew to the English, right?
Yeah, that's his big thing, is getting the tempos down, because he's big into the poetic narrative. And so he comes there and he saw, and look, there was a well in the field, and look, there was 3. It's actually like almost this squirrel moment where he's like very intentionally, oh, it's there, oh, there, there.
You hear the urgency, and it draws you as a reader and as a hearer into the present of that past moment. When you were reading it and it was look, it was like, I need to look right now, and that's literarily very ingenious. And it's actually exactly what the Gospel of Mark does. With the Gospel of Mark, the urgency in that narrative is always apparent, because Mark is always saying things like, then immediately Jesus drew forth into the wilderness, then immediately. And there might be better words than immediately, but in most English translations, to try to get to that urgency, that word immediately is always used. So I think Alter is bringing that out here also.
So that's one of the things that I'd love to spend a lot more time talking about with you, is translation, because we always mean to, and we don't get there. But that's something that I think is missing from a lot of the translations that I've read growing up, like New American Standard or NIV, even ESV, which is one of my favorites. Is you've got this more literal take, to forgive the phrase, but they're really trying to be very clear with translating words exactly as they might be in English, but in doing so, missing some of the things that would potentially draw out that poetic language. And the trouble is, like, when you add that poetic language back in, there is some translating that has to be done, and translating being putting what I believe would have been the narrative. So there's a little bit of self that's put into that.
That's it.
But at the same time, to not take that into consideration also degrades the original audience who would have heard the poetry or the language. I gave you an example of this. So Job, the very first passage of it, this is Alter's translation. I loved it. It made me fall in love with the Old Testament. a man there was from the land of Uz, Job his name. And you can hear it. You're like, oh, this is a poem.
Yeah.
It's almost Seussian, right?
Yes.
You almost hear the Dr. Seuss stuff there. And you're like,
Yeah.
But when you see that language and the urgency and you can read it that way, it really does bring something phenomenal to it. And by the way, Robert Alter is not just somebody that Chris and I enjoy. He is very well renowned, and his work on the Old Testament has been not glorified. That's maybe the wrong word, but like amplified even in the New York Times and the New Yorker and other places that are not even necessarily spiritual have looked at the work that he's done on these and said, this is profoundly important work, because you're not just bringing life to these, but you're also giving the context and the descriptions around it. And that's something else that's missing a lot of folks. We read translations, we don't speak the original, and then we don't look at the footnotes because they aren't there. And to be able to see those translation notes and understand why things were described a certain way, really, really helpful.
I'm so glad you said that. And one of the biggest problems when it comes to scripture, I think for people who just aren't thinking in these terms, is we come to these things and we treat things that were meant to be poetry and obvious story, we treat them like legal briefs or like scientific
document.
Yeah, and I understand philosophically and historically and socially why that move occurs in history, but God, I mean, so much is lost. Much is lost. Then Alter is one of these who gives some of that back to us.
Yeah. And is not necessarily doing disservice to the text and making things up.
No.
He's taking it very seriously.
That's exactly the point. He wouldn't spend his life doing this if he was just some, charlatan. He's not. And there's not a theological axe to grind. Alter, as I'm assuming that he grew up in a Jewish home, right? His project is, number one, I think you could look at it as I don't want to say a recontextualization, but a literary contextualization of the Hebrew Scriptures without a narrative agenda that we as Christians bring to the text. And I mean agenda in a neutral way. I don't mean in a bad way. But that lets us recover what it is that Jesus himself was responding to in the Tanakh, and what it is that Jesus' earliest followers were responding to in the stories that they would have heard in the rhythms of poetry, in the rhythms of story, in the rhythms of campfire and caravan, and all of those things that are so important in the transition and the transmission of these sacred stories. Yeah.
And I think that when you see those themes played out, they don't necessarily take anything away from that. Just because you're not necessarily reading the overt Christophanies that we're inserting back into it, removing that doesn't take away from the narrative that leads up to what Jesus would then fulfill.
Exactly. And I think it actually helps us understand the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scripture, in a way that is more honest and authentic. Because if you read it just in sort of a traditional English translation, and you're committed to sort of this, 19th century, early 20th century rubric of fundamentalism or literalism, there are a lot of questions you can't answer.
Yeah.
And you pretend that you can, and you pretend that it's okay that God in Deuteronomy is telling Israel to kill all the Canaanite children,
Right.
But if you can recover the story dynamic and the motifs and the psychological trauma and everything like that from what we say is a living text, then you might be able to better understand why did human beings who felt that they were experiencing God in this way not leave this stuff out? Why did they include it apart from, let's say, political agenda or whatever? I think it makes the Bible more accessible, and I think it makes it, dare I say, more sacred.
Yeah.
Because we realize there's a give and take here.
There's an ambiguity to some of these stories, but when you see them running concurrently, you can understand that the ambiguity is intentional. Like, they don't necessarily line up in a way that says this is how you have to live life. They're just stories that like thematically connect to each other. But that kind of connects back to the play that the musical that you just watched, right? Your son said at the end, there wasn't really any answers. There wasn't any resolution in a lot of these stories. There was, but it's ambiguous.
Yeah.
And those are harder to grapple with, but they're more meaningful because they cause a lot more thinking and a lot more space that's given to those. Because if I see the ending clearly, or if I see every answer laid out the way it should be, it's harder for me to read my own story into that and have my story read by that. But when there's some ambiguity and there's something that's a little different, then all of a sudden it's Chris and I see something and we're like, oh, that matches what I'm dealing with right now. There's a lot more recontextualization that we're able to do when we have that ambiguity that you just don't get. If it's only fact, it doesn't become metaphor, and then it doesn't transcend.
I have nothing to add. That was awesome.
Yeah. Sometimes I say good things.
A lot. All the time.
You too, man.
All the time. Nathan is good all the time.
I think the last thing I just thought was kind of interesting, and this is actually from Alter. This is not in the text. There's nothing in the text that indicates that this was going on. But he does recall back this Isaac motif of the steward or the servant bringing 10 camels laden with gifts. And now Laban's running out and kissing Jacob, and he's giving this big embrace. And it says here that Rashi shrewdly notes that Laban could be recalling the last time someone came from this branch of the family, brought 10 heavily laden camels with him, and possibly the embrace is to see whether or not Jacob has any gold secured to his person. I'm picturing did you watch Les Mis? Master
I'm thinking
of
of
the
Aladdin.
House. Or Aladdin.
Yeah, Master of that. Yeah.
He's like coming in.
He's got 75 golden monkey.
That's right. He's like hugging him and, trying to find out how much he can grab from his person in the midst of that. Do you have any gold in there?
He's like, you just swipe my wallet, bro?
You didn't bring any. I don't know about any gold. What are you talking about? What gold did you bring with you? I don't know. That's not actually in the text, but it is a very old commentator that's looking at this and saying, yeah, it's possible. The mirroring of these two motifs where you have the servant that's coming very heavily laden, whereas Jacob, who's basically coming as a fugitive, as you said, is very different. And it's also different in the treatment that he's going to get.
Yes, and it's so interesting because the ongoing revelation in the Tanakh is when the stranger comes to you, treat them the way you would treat God if he were coming to you. And Laban, we'll see, is taking advantage of Jacob, which in one way is great because Jacob gets some comeuppance, but in another way, you're exactly right. Laban treats Jacob the way you would treat somebody who came to you asking for your daughter and brought you nothing in return in those days.
Yeah, where's the gold, man? Where's the bridal... where's the bridal price, right? What's going on here? Are you showing up here? What are you going to get? What's in it for me?
I can picture Laban being like, Jacob, Rebecca's son, the boy comes and thinks he moves a stone, he gets a wife. What, your son big man moving a stone? When your father came to my father, do you know what he brought?
Yeah. That wasn't that long ago.
He had someone move stones for him.
I have an expectation. My sister, there was 10 camels.
Yes.
How many camels you bring? 0 camels. Let's see what's going to happen. You can stay with me for a little while. Let's see what's going to happen here. Yeah, we can't let go of that though, because he probably knew that this was going to happen at some point in time too, right? I can't imagine these families had no communication, so he probably expected Esau or Jacob were going to show up at some point. With camels.
Looking for a wife. Yeah. Yep. In fact, he probably expected both of them because he has 2 daughters. Rebecca has 2 sons. He probably thought there'd be 20 camels.
20 camels. And Jacob shows up and he's like, you're the servant? Where's the camels? My dad got camels. What's going on? As I was saying this, I don't want this to come off as that we're condoning arranged marriages with bridal prices at all. Clearly, we don't condone that at all, and this is a very patriarchal society that's thinking this way. But we're trying to explain Laban's thought process.
Yeah.
And it would be like the son who has parents that are well off, and then they don't include him in the will.
Yeah.
And they're like, wait, what? I've been the faithful son for my entire life. Where's my inheritance, Dad? I'm speaking of Esau here.
Sure.
Like, where's my blessing? So you see that sort of idea of that other side where it's not necessarily contempt for, but it's this idea of, wait, like, where's my stuff? Where did my stuff go?
Yeah.
I don't know that's necessarily overtly in the text, but I think it is interesting that it probably crossed Laban's
definitely
mind.
We're meant to think about that, though, I think.
Yeah.
And that, like you said, to your point, Nathan, that's the beauty of this is when you only take it literally, it can't become metaphor, and it can't make you think about those things, and
Yeah.
it can't transcend, and it can't resonate, and it can't become sacred for you. It can't become your story.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So if I think about this for us, like where are the places where we have unmet expectations? That might be an interesting thing to think about. I don't know that I have an answer for that because that was just a question that came to my mind. But
Yeah.
like for you and me and for our listeners, are there places where we have this expectation that good is coming our way?
Yeah.
And then when it doesn't come, do we have some sort of resentment that builds up where we think we need to still get what we need, or we're going to get what's coming to us?
The resolution. Yeah.
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 Because I think that's probably something that's not necessarily overtly said, but very covertly said in these stories is, and that doesn't end up well for Laban,
Right.
that line of thinking. And when we can catch those expectations early and say, whatever good does come our way, be grateful for it. But when good doesn't come our way and we expected it, be careful not to let that resentment become a place where we can't let go and we expect more, because otherwise even more can be taken from us.
That's exactly right.
Foreshadowing.
And you're only hurting yourself. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Because the Loki character here is getting tricked in the next couple of passages, but we know that Loki does not stay down for long.
That's right. Yep.
So this is totally a side note. I didn't make that connection between Thor and Loki and Jacob and Esau until this very minute.
It's good. It's really good.
And now I'm going to be looking at the Jacob and Esau story every time I look at Thor and Loki and all those other Marvel movies. I don't know that it's necessarily there, but I do think that those are ancient characters. They are not just Marvel characters. And I do think that whole brother motif of Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Thor and Loki, there is something to it. And that trickster character, there's got to be some sort of common ancestry there.
And if I could project Christophany into Loki season 2, it would be, Loki sacrificing himself on the world tree to sustain eternity.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one of the reasons that the Christian missionaries had success eventually with the Norse, is because the world tree was taken as a typology of the cross.
Yeah.
And it was Thor with the world tree, but in Loki season 2, I guess I just, spoiler alert, sorry.
Great.
But
Haven't finished that one yet.
it's Loki and the world tree binding everything together. Have you really not? Did I just spoil that for you?
That's okay.
Oh my
I think it
God.
might mean more to me now that I actually have that connection made. So
I
now
just
it's
assumed.
gonna,
I'm sorry.
It's a good spoiling because a pre-spoiler. My son, my middle son, one of my middle sons, and I watched the first season together, and then there's just so much Marvel stuff. I just haven't had the time and energy to just make it through all that stuff.
So I apologize if I just ruined the investment you have in this series, but you do have to watch it. I just check it out.
I will.
But great discussion today, Nathan. Really interesting things. I really loved your insight, especially about the transcendent and what we lose when we only let these stories be literal. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
To our listeners, thank you for listening, for joining us in this hour. Please subscribe, or dislike, just engage. That's all we really want in our 40s, Nathan. We want people to engage. But make sure you check out Elle's Phoenix Effect podcast. That's Nathan's wife, Elle. We are on there, and we are doing our best. Just two guys doing our best, right, Nathan?
That's right. Finding help where we need it. Thanks for being that help for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.